So this is back as a reminder as to what our session is going to be all about. So the way that we actually decided the order of the panels was from that question in the pre-registration link, which said what is most urgent or pertinent for your organization, and also what you were most interested in as a leader or a manager. So that really informed us and helped us structure what was kind of most urgent and pertinent for you. So if you see here, you'll see that we have our first speaker is going to be on strategy and annual plans. Then of course the financial impact and resources, dealing with donors, HR and labor relations, and then figuring out new operations. Please do put your questions in the chat, but I also highly recommend that as the panelist is speaking, just take your notes, and then at 11 o'clock when you can actually add your questions in the chat, and it'll just make it a little bit easier on our side. Yeah, okay. So moving to our first panelist. So our first panelist is Robbie Martina. She's the co-founder and chief strategy officer at Epi1 Healthcare Solutions. She oversees the strategy of this healthcare startup, and she's a public health specialist and strategist with over 11 years of experience in research, advisory, growth strategy, product design, and management, as well as public health project implementation and M&E. So the reason why we asked Robbie is really the question about this strategy and annual plans. So we, as organizations, all have ongoing strategies and had planned for the year, and this has completely upended them. So big questions that we had, that we shared with Robbie was, what are some of the different things that we can do? What are our different approaches? And what can we think about in order to make sure that we are able to have those annual plans come right? So Robbie, I'm going to, please, can you give a few seconds in order to make sure that the transitions work well? And I'm going to turn off my presentation, and then Robbie, you're going to unmute yourself and start your presentation.
Okay, hello.
Hello, we hear you, Robbie. Please go ahead.
All right, I'm going to also turn my camera on. I think it just creates a bit of a personal touch. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rufaro, and everybody who was involved in preparing this webinar. Disclaimer right from the beginning, I did not put together a presentation. It was actually a deliberate choice. I think I was worried that with 15 minutes and with quite a bit of content to cover, it is very easy for folks to focus on what is in front of them, all the writing, and that we don't get enough time to really absorb the content. So I'm actually going to speak for the 15 minutes. If folks want some advice or some of the notes or anything, feel free to reach out to me after this conversation. Rufaro has my contacts, and I'll be more than happy to provide some of the material. So as I was preparing for this conversation, and again, thank you everybody for all the questions and the comments that Rufaro has shared with me. As I was preparing for this, I think two things weighed on me. One is the fact that the concept of strategy itself is quite broad, right? It's very important, but it's also quite broad. And so it can be challenging to try and tackle this within 15 minutes. The second thing was the fact that I have very little view over who is on this call, but I'm going to assume that there's quite a bit of variability in terms of the types of organizations that are on this webinar, where they are located, what sort of sectors they're focusing on, what their resource base is, and things of that nature. And so what I settled on was to provide you with a framework. All right. And the idea of a framework is that it is a tool that you can then take and apply to your organization, whatever the situation, whatever the circumstances. When I build frameworks, I like to use questions. There are different ways of building frameworks. And the reason I like to use questions is because, one, questions allow us to focus. And then 2, questions are a lot more memorable. It's easy to remember the 2 or 3 most important questions than it is to remember, you know, a complicated statement or diagram for planning. So I'm going to share with you 5 questions today, and that is essentially what I'll focus on in this 15 minutes. And then we're going to go through those 5 questions. I will provide some examples as we try to unpack those questions. And hopefully at the end of the session, you will have enough to then take back to your organization as you think about what you're going to be doing during COVID-19 and also post-COVID-19. So let's start with the 5 questions. The first question, and sorry, I tend to have a dry throat when I'm speaking, so you'll see me drinking every now and then. The first question is, what is your strategy? Very simple. What is your strategy? The second question is, what is the context for your strategy? Or in other words, what are the assumptions that informed your strategy? The third question is, what has changed? So with COVID-19, what has changed? The fourth question is, how do these changes affect your organization's strategy? And then the last one is, how do you respond, adapt, and learn? So those are the 5 questions that we're going to go through, and let's jump right in. So the first one is, what is your strategy? Now, this is fairly elementary, and I'm going to hope that most folks on this webinar have actually spent some time defining their strategy, articulating what that is. But it's also possible that some people have not really spent time doing that or did it a long time ago. Now, to me, this is the baseline, all right? You cannot begin to understand how COVID-19 has affected your strategy if you don't really have an understanding of what your strategy is in the first place. So this is your baseline. That is your starting point. So very quick pointers for folks who need to just perhaps do a bit of work in defining that or need to review their strategies. In my world, I think there are 4 things you need to do to actually have a good strategy, or 4 things that you need to have. One is, to me, the vision, all right? That essentially speaks to who you are as an organization. 2, it's the objective. And that's essentially, what is the problem that you are trying to solve for? 3 is your plan of action. How are you going to meet your objective? What activities are you going to do to actually solve that problem? And then the last one is performance measurement. Essentially, how are you going to track and monitor your progress towards achieving that goal? So 4 things: your vision, your objective, your plan of action, and your performance management or measurement. Annual plans, I know there's been quite a bit of questions on annual plans as well. To me, annual plans are sort of linked to the hip with strategies. When we plan, when we do strategies, we typically think in 3 or 5 year circles. We've got a few ambitious people who go as far as 10 years, but typically it's 3 or 5 year circles. And so what an annual plan does is it says, well, if this is what I want to achieve in 5 years, well, these are the steps I have to take on an annual basis to ensure that I'm actually on track to meeting my goal, my objective in 5 years. So an annual plan should not be treated as a separate tool or a separate document. The annual plan must actually be linked to your strategy, all right? So that's very quickly, what is your strategy? If you haven't defined that, my advice is take some time to at least put something down, because that will inform how you then proceed to understand how COVID-19 has affected your organization. The second question, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this one and the third one, and that is to say, what is the context for your strategy, or what assumptions did you make, or what assumptions informed your strategy? It's interesting that whenever I've worked with organizations, companies, etc., in building out strategies, this is actually the step that most people forget, all right? And they just sort of jump into, I want to do this, and I'm going to go, and this is how I'm going to build it out, and I'm going to run. But very few times do we stop to consider actually what is informing, what assumptions are we making about this strategy, all right? We try to predict the future when we build strategies because we are thinking 5 years ahead. But even when we do so, that future is very much informed by our understanding of the present, all right? So it's very important to have a very good sense of of what present informed your strategy. So let me give a very quick example. There's probably somebody sitting here who's at the end of their 5-year strategy, all right? That means that whatever they're working with was defined or designed sometime around 2014, 2015. Now, the world has changed quite a bit since 2014, 2015. Even if we don't take into consideration COVID-19, the world has actually changed. So it's very hard for you to just jump on to think about what you can do if you don't consider what kind of world you were looking at when you're building your strategy back in 2014, 2015. All right. So that's the second question. What is the context and what assumptions informed your strategy? The third one, and I will introduce an example here, then we'll go back and forth between these two questions. The third question is what has changed with COVID-19? Now, we can all agree that I think the one thing that COVID-19 has injected into the space is uncertainty. There are a number of uncertainties, and we'll go through some during this webinar, but I think that is perhaps the key factor here. There are a number of uncertainties that have been injected into the space, and now we have to respond to these uncertainties, right? However, I want to also perhaps caution some of us. I was just speaking to my team yesterday, and we had quite a bit of discussion over this, and I said that, you know, because there's quite a lot of anxiety around COVID-19, it's so easy for everybody to assume that, oh my gosh, COVID-19 has changed everything for me. And I'm going to panic and I'm going to be anxious. And what that happens is some people just freeze, some people go on overdrive. But perhaps it's important to just pause and think carefully, what has actually really changed for my organization? And I'm going to introduce two examples here to help us unpack this. Let's take two NGOs, all right? I'm going to use these examples for the rest of the questions. Let's have one NGO working in the health sector and the other one working in education, all right? Now, the NGO that works in the health sector, I think somebody needs to go on mute. All right, I hope we go on mute. Perfect. Let's say that the NGO in the health sector, they've decided that they're
Sorry, Robbie, I'm really sorry. Somebody has muted you for the last 30 seconds. Can you please ask whoever else is hasn't muted, please mute yourself. And Robbie, please can you just go over what you were just saying for the last 10 seconds? I'm so sorry about that. Sorry, you're still muted. You have to unmute yourself. We can't do it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Just just make sure you're just looking to see if somebody mutes you. It'll give a notification. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right. I think maybe I'll start from the point where I started discussing the third question, which is to speak to what has actually changed. And what I'd said was that I think we can all agree that what COVID-19 has injected into our space is uncertainty. But it's very important for us to spend time to understand exactly how this affects our organization. I think there's a tendency to sort of panic and overreact and actually think that everything is changed and, oh my goodness, what is going to happen? But if you perhaps pause and think and consider your situation, you might actually find out that perhaps COVID-19 has changed things for the better. And so I'm going to use two examples here to illustrate my point. And I just started describing those NGOs. Let's take two NGOs, one in the health sector, one in the education sector, all right? Let's say that the NGO, and I'm completely making up this example, so there's no particular NGO that I'm speaking to here. Let's say that the healthcare NGO has a mandate, or the objective is to prevent lifestyle diseases among urban youth, all right? And lifestyle diseases are your hypertension, your diabetes, what we typically refer to as non-communicable diseases, okay? Let's take the education NGO. Let's say that what they focus on is supporting disadvantaged youth in their matric year and ensuring that they get at least a bachelor's pass and can transition into institutions of higher learning. So 2 organizations working in 2 different sectors, very different mandates, all right? If we step back and look at what I had spoken about, the context and assumptions around how you define your objective and your strategy, I think very quickly we can say for the health organization, let's say 3-4 years ago when they defined their strategy, we know globally there was quite a bit of interest picking up on non-communicable diseases, quite a bit of funding made available. Essentially, we're starting to realize that it's not just about HIV, AIDS, and malaria and TB. There are other diseases that we need to be focusing on. And so they took the opportunity and they set up something and continued running with it. With the education NGO, let's think about them from an annual plan perspective, and I'm trying to provide examples on both, right? So we know that disadvantaged youth always have a problem within the education system and they require a bit of support. So let's say it was December 2019, they're making their annual plan and the assumptions really were we're going to have, let's say, 200 school days in the coming school year. We were going to cover this amount of content and we're going to provide this amount of support. So those were the assumptions that they were making, and that was the context that was informed the strategy for the health NGO. Now, when we go to the third question, which is what has actually changed, all right? What has COVID-19 changed? Let's start with the health NGO, all right? Now, it's true that Corona has actually refocused our priorities and folks are really thinking about how to manage this pandemic. But if we think carefully, one of the things we are learning from Corona is actually the fact that there are certain pre-existing conditions that put people at more risk, all right, for severe cases or even for death, all right? And some of these conditions are actually things like hypertension, diabetes, what will be considered lifestyle diseases, right? So if you're this health NGO, yes, Corona is sort of shifting the focus, moving things around a little bit. But if you think carefully, your focus area is still relevant. And in fact, it could be even more relevant after COVID-19. So while things have shifted, there's quite a bit of a positive energy for you, or at least a positive development, because you already chose an area that is likely to be quite of interest after after COVID-19. But for the education NGO, let's talk about them. So we said one of their major assumptions was the number of school days they were going to have in the year and how much content they're going to cover. For them, the lockdown actually is a big problem, because what it's done is it has reduced the number of school days, all right? It has made it difficult for them to cover content and to support their students. So for them, the uncertainty that COVID has brought on the country, and specifically the lockdown and its limitations, have serious impact on their annual plan. What am I trying to demonstrate here? I'm trying to say that when you start thinking about what COVID-19 means for your organization, and when you start drilling down to how things have changed and what that change looks like for your organization, not everything is actually going to sit on the negative side of things. There's going to be a spectrum, and I think it's very important to undertake that exercise and understand where you sit on that spectrum. Let's move on to the fourth question, and I'll combine this with the fifth question, which is, how does this change affect my organization strategy and how can I respond? So when I was speaking to Rufaro, I understood that people were quite interested in scenario planning. And I think that is an excellent tool, actually, for situations like this. Scenario planning essentially says that when you have moments of uncertainty, you have to consider a number of possibilities and plan for those possibilities. All right, that's the basic definition. It's a tool that was developed around the 70s, and organizations have used it for decades now, for different reasons. It was very popular during the economic downturn of 2007, 2008, and it will definitely be an important tool today. So I'm going to use the concept of scenario planning to walk through those last two questions, okay? When you think of scenario planning, I think there are about 5 things that you need to do, all right? One, you need to be very clear on what uncertainties you're dealing with. And that's something we've just discussed on question 3, right? What's the change? What are the uncertainties that I'm dealing with, right? And you need to list them. Now, I think this can become a bit of a redundant exercise if we try to pick up every possible uncertainty. So you have to be a bit more focused on what the big picture uncertainties are. And then the second thing is you have to decide the most important one for you. So if we take the example that I just gave you, right? For the education NGO, the length of the lockdown is an absolutely critical uncertainty. And that will be top of their list when they think about scenario planning. For the health NGO, while yes, the length of the lockdown is a consideration, I would argue that the relevance of their focus area is actually a much bigger consideration. For them, the question is, do I stay relevant? Am I doing the right thing in the health space now? And will I be able to get the attention of government and donors during and after COVID-19? So yes, the lockdown perhaps has shifted things here and there, but for them, the relevance of their core business is actually very important. So it's really important to say, well, there are a number of uncertainties, but of these, let me prioritize and understand which one truly matters for my organization. And the next thing is to say you need to develop scenarios, possible scenarios, okay? Now, very quickly, let's take the health NGO. If we've decided that the length of the lockdown is actually the most critical uncertainty, then the scenarios will be based on that uncertainty, all right? So for example, you can say, well, scenario 1, lockdown ends on April the 16th. Scenario 2, lockdown is extended and perhaps ends sometime in May. Scenario 3, lockdown is stopped, but actually we have a few more short lockdowns in the coming months. And then scenario 4, perhaps the lockdown extends all the way to August or September, right? So that critical uncertainty becomes the defining element of your scenarios, right? The same could be said about the health NGO. You will then say, well, my scenarios will be, perhaps my focus area remains relevant, or maybe my focus topic remains relevant, but people are not so much interested in lifestyle disease among youth. They are now shifting all their focus to lifestyle disease among the elderly, right? So again, your scenarios will be based on what the critical uncertainty is. And then you have to define what the implication is. So let's stick to the health NGO, right? For them, the single most important implication is the number of days they're going to lose, all right? Because that speaks directly to how much content and support they can provide. For the health NGO, it's about the resources, it's about the attention they can get to their prospective donors, it's about the type of programming that they can actually do, because that's the direct implication given different scenarios. And then once you do that, you then start to identify your solutions. Now, if we had more time, we'll break this further, but I think I'll just give a few pointers here in terms of how you then identify your solutions. So one is, you must have a plan for at least 2 or 3 of those scenarios, okay? The idea here is not to pick one scenario and plan for it because of uncertainty, right? Things are shifting every day. So it will be quite unwise to put all your efforts in planning for one potential scenario when you actually don't know if that will be true next week. The idea is to move from your best to worst case scenario, have about 2 or 3 scenarios, and then have a plan of action for each of these 3 scenarios. Okay, so that's really important. So the idea here is not to choose one, but is to choose at least 2 or 3 that cover the entire spectrum and then plan for those. Okay, the second thing I want to point out here is, as you do that, don't lose focus of the long-term goal. So I was speaking to my team yesterday and I say to them, at some point, COVID-19 will end, all right? And if we shift everything just to react for COVID-19, we will wake up sometime in October and some of our goals still need to be met and we've done absolutely nothing for that, right? So it's very important to still maintain that long-term view. Again, going back to what your strategy is and keeping a long-term view on what I need to achieve. And even though I'm shifting a few things now, I still need to achieve my long-term goal. And then the last thing I think for me is adapting and learning. So every week, literally, or maybe every day, we have to adapt to the information that government is sharing with us. We have to adapt to the plans that government is putting forward, whether it's the lockdown or something else. And so it's very important during this time for the leadership to be able to be agile, to adapt and learn very quickly and pass on to the team. I think it's very unhelpful to have a very rigid system in this time and to be very wedded to a particular plan of action because you want to be flexible to adjust to different things. The last point I'm going to make, so that I think I can probably pause there and I'll take questions at the end of this, is communication. I know this came through quite a bit. How do we then communicate? I think at a very high level, I'll say two things. One is, I think your communication will depend on the type of organization you have. If you're a small organization that is fairly flat with responsibilities, information, knowledge fairly distributed across your team, I would actually encourage you to undertake this exercise as a team. It's a beautiful and a very important way to make sure that you're bringing everybody along the journey and that everybody feels involved in actually coming up with alternative plans of actions, and that way they have ownership, a sense of ownership of these plans of action. However, if you have a much bigger organization or an that is fairly hierarchical, or you have an organization that is distributed across, large parts of the country or the continent, I would actually suggest that you probably focus this on your senior and maybe mid-level management. You conduct this exercise and then you communicate this to the rest of the team. I think sometimes an overload of information to junior members of the team can be counterproductive. It can cause them to panic. So it is better for you to walk through this exercise, define your plan of actions, and then speak to your team and get their feedback on that. All right. So I'll stop there. I hope that framing, those examples have helped. And if you have any questions, please post them on the chat and I'll respond to them at the end of the webinar. Thank you. Back to you, Rufaro.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Robbie, for that presentation. I think there was a lot that we, kind of for some people are confirmed that we're doing the right things. But if you do have questions, you can post them in the chat. Please see in the chat, I've just added how to post your questions so that we can make sure that they're correctly directed. We will then engage with you with the question and take the questions in the open session from 11:15. So what's going to happen now is we're moving to the next presenter. So our next presentation is with Jill Bates, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Charities Aid Foundation Southern Africa. Jill is the CEO of CAFSA, and she has 30 years of experience, largely spent in corporate social investment space, and she's managed the trusts and foundations of companies listed on the JSE and primarily in the financial services sector. Prior to leading CAFSA, Jill is a clinical social work practice and she holds a BA in social work and psychology. So with Jill, we found out about the resources that CAFSA is starting to put together in terms of determining the financial impact of this situation on nonprofits, because there are quite a few, like we hear about the Solidarity Fund and the SMME support, but a lot of nonprofits, and this is a lot of the questions that we got in our pre-registration was, where is the support for nonprofits? So Jill, I'm going to hand over to you. Please, can you start loading your presentation, and then I will hand over to you to turn on your microphone and video, which you already have done, and we'll get started. Thank you, Jill, and welcome.
Rufaro, thank you so much. And like my previous colleague, I have not got a PowerPoint presentation. I really want to use this time really to talk with colleagues. So I hope that's going to be okay with you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I think you've just been muted. I'm not sure why. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Please unmute yourself and go ahead. We'll be tracking the chat to make sure if anyone is having trouble with hearing you.
All right, super. Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you for the invitation to join this very important conversation. And firstly, I also want to acknowledge the critical work that all the colleagues, both on the panel and in the audience, are doing during these unprecedented times. So colleagues, if I may, I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time just to tell you a little bit about the Charities Aid Foundation Southern Africa, for those of you who are not familiar with our work. We ourselves are a registered non-profit organization with public benefit organization status. We've been operational in South Africa for in excess of 20 years. And essentially, CAPSA is a civil society infrastructure organization. And breaking that down, that effectively means that we are an intermediary and that we operate at the intersection between philanthropy and civil society. So really, putting it in very simple terms, CAPSA's primary reason for being is to champion and to grow charitable giving in South Africa and beyond. Colleagues, CAPSA in itself does not fundraise for non-profit organizations. CAPSA is the intermediary that mobilizes and advocates for resources into civil society. So we really, really want to grow and champion charitable giving across the world. Our primary mission, as my previous colleague spoke about, really is to support a vibrant and strong civil society, which obviously in our country is a critical pillar of our young democracy. So really our entire focus is to get as much funding as possible into civil society, obviously via the non-profit sector. We are at the moment, like many colleagues, especially worried about the non-profit sector because of the core and critical role that the non-profit sector plays in our country. Civil society has traditionally and historically rendered services that either augment the efforts of government, or in fact, organizations render critical services where none exist. So in our view, were the civil society and non-profit sector to be brought to its knees, this would be disastrous for our country. So that's really our concern, and that's how we work. Obviously, because we're an intermediary, we work with corporate clients and we also work with our non-profit clients. So for our corporate clients, we move funding in various ways. We have a Give As You Earn program where our corporate clients, their employees, contribute on a monthly basis to a particular cause. The corporate may choose to match that grant, and both those contributions are paid over to CAPSA, who manages the distribution of those funds wherever the employee directs that those funds must go. CAPSA, I must also say, is absolutely ruthless and religious about governance and compliance. And my fellow panelist, Khamotso, who is, I'm proud to say, a CAPSA board member, and she oversees our governance committee. So governance, compliance, legal, due diligence, etc., is a non-negotiable for CAPSA. The other programs we run, obviously, are funds under management, where donors direct where funding should go, into what programs, what organizations. We also operate in the employee volunteering space. CAPSA is also, obviously, we're a knowledge-driven business, and because we advise our clients on critical matters relating to their spend, we are heavily involved in the dissemination of empirical research, which we do in this country and internationally. We're also a proud strategic member of the CAF Global Alliance. So we have a presence in the UK, the US, Canada, India, Russia, Brazil, Australia, Bulgaria, obviously, as well as in South Africa. And while these organizations and these offices are all autonomous, we share a single and single driven purpose, and that is to transfer monies to civil society in our various geographies. This obviously also assists CAFSA to have access to the best thinking, the best practice, the best learnings, best practice policy, strategy, and research that informs our advice to our corporate clients. Obviously, our other clients who are probably maybe even more important to us are our non-profit clients. And we want to assist those clients we really want to put those non-profit organizations, we want to link them with corporate clients who are looking for a non-profit in a particular sector. And how we do that, we offer our non-profit clients a validations process where they can undergo a simple validations process with CAFSA and get placed on our database. And that then would make them eligible for donors who are looking for non-profit organizations in particular sectors. Obviously, in response to COVID-19, CAFSA and its board of directors has moved very quickly to launch an emergency fund that is going to be aimed essentially entirely at supporting critical non-profit organizations and community-based organizations that are rendering critical services to those most vulnerable in our community. And that is where our primary concern is. This fund has only recently been launched. And I'm pleased to say that CAFSA has been approached by the Oppenheimer family, although they have made their 1 billion donation to the Solidarity Fund, which focuses primarily on supporting SMMEs through this crisis.
Sorry, Jill, you've just been muted again. Can you unmute yourself?
Apologies, am I back?
Yes, you are.
All right, so I was saying we're pleased to announce that the Oppenheimers open discussions with CAFSA, because in addition to their support of the Solidarity Fund, which focuses on SMMEs, they have a deep concern for civil society and non-profit organizations as well. So I am in the process of concluding an agreement with the family. The announcement is going to go live in the next day or two. And we're going to be issuing a call to South African nonprofits and CBOs to approach us to apply for some aid. We are, having said that, we are very critical about due diligence. We understand that we are operating in a crisis situation, so we are trying to combine due diligence practices with speed. And I'm working closely together with Khamotso and the rest of my board to ensure that these funds flow very smoothly and very quickly. As I mentioned, because we are also associated with a global alliance, I have been receiving calls from my fellow global CAF CEOs from around the world, who have South Africans domiciled in their particular geographies, who are likewise wanting to contribute to this emergency fund. So those discussions are happening on a constant basis. We're looking at cross-border giving. Obviously, we're needing to be mindful of legalities and tax situation in the various geographies, but we are working round the clock to build that fund so that we can get those monies out to civil society very quickly. Colleagues, really just to share some thoughts, that we've been having across the world and within our own team and within our own board. Obviously, these are unprecedented times, as we all know. And in our opinion, now more than ever, collaboration and partnerships must be the key currency. I know that this must sound almost counterintuitive to organizations who are competing for a finite amount of resources, but now is the time to collaborate, to communicate. There's absolutely no doubt in our minds that a crisis like this would require a multi-sectoral approach. So we are in discussions with governments, with corporates, and with civil society in respect of how we can bring a collaborated approach to this crisis. Obviously, we ourselves as CAFSA, we're a small organization, and notwithstanding that, we're also having to practice agility. We're also having to adapt and learn. None of us as a team typically have worked from home, for example. We prefer to put in longer hours at our office. That is no longer obviously an option for us. So we've had to learn to embrace and leverage technology, which we've had to do very quickly as we have our Zoom meetings with our South African colleagues and our international colleagues right through the day and night. We also know that we've got to display a willingness to work in new and different ways. We have to do more with less, obviously. So we're obviously watching cost containment and wasteful expenditure. We also are obviously reimagining the future. And where we will land after COVID-19 hopefully will be a thing of the past. And we're asking ourselves questions like, do we even need offices? Do we need this kind of infrastructure that we've been maintaining for years? So COVID is really making us really critically reevaluate our practice. And some of the questions that we are asking ourselves in the face of this crisis is, what should we as an organization, what would we be doing more of? What should we be doing less of? And what should we stop doing altogether? So it's an opportunity now for us to really, as I say, critically examine our practice. Our mission remains the same as I think my previous speaker colleague said. Our mission will not change, or our vision will not change during this crisis. Our primary concern remains getting as much money into civil society as possible. But we obviously have to look at how we work and how we do that. We also know that communication is absolutely key. We must communicate all the time. We have to obviously seek opportunity in adversity and make that work for us. We understand that we also at this time, we have to deepen donor intimacy and professional intimacy with our partners and our clients, who they themselves in many ways are uncertain. They face exactly the uncertainties in the corporate sector that we do in the nonprofit sector. So it's really deepening that capacity to communicate, building and strengthening relationships, as in everything with life. It's all about relationships. And I think really we also need to have a very strong value proposition to make ourselves attractive for our donor organizations. So colleagues, I think I'll stop there as part of the formal presentation, and I'll gladly take questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was really insightful. I think one of the key questions, and maybe you could post this in the chat, that people are going to have is, what are some of the things that organizations need to have to kind of get through that due diligence process to register with CAFSA, which I'm assuming is part of being able to access the fund that you've been able to put together. So congratulations on that fund. I know it's a big question that so many people had, and well done to CAF Southern Africa for doing that and also leading the charge for others in the region and globally. Thank you. So our next speaker is Charmaine Kolile Zondi. She's a client relationship manager at Chukululu Social Investments. She's part of a team that leads and manages strategic implementation of CSI investment for C-suite corporate clients. And in this capacity, her and the team ensures that there's successful and catalytic social investment. So Charmaine really works at that key interface between kind of CSI and nonprofits, and making sure that we are speaking to to make sure that we both understand each other and what needs to happen. And so we're hoping to get some insights from her about where donors are kind of sitting at the moment, some trends, as well as some of what we can do and advice that she has of what we can do in how we deal with and communicate with donors. So thanks, Charmaine. Over to you now. Charmaine, you're still muted.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Good day, everyone. Rufaro, I did send you a sort of a slide, and I was trying to share it now, and I'm not having the best of times with that. I was trying to just share just one slide, and it really has not, it doesn't have much of the content, but it just gives you a context of who I am and the work that I believe in and what drives me and what I'm passionate about. So as Rufaro has said, Olile Charmaine Zondi from Umlazi Township, been working in Johannesburg and basically in the civil society sector for the past, I think, since I was around, okay, so for the past 12 years without revealing my age. And so it's been really an amazing opportunity for me to work with the people that work in this sector. And then faced with the inequality of South Africa, it's also given us an opportunity to really look at ourselves in terms of how we are working together, regardless of the sectors that you're in. So whether you're in business, you are in civil society, you are in government, there's been a real galvanization of our humanity, of who we are, of us just working together, collaborating and reaching out to each other constantly and very deliberately. So when I was asked to talk about this topic, I think the most important thing that I wanted to reassure everyone on is that we can't take lightly the magnitude of what the world is going through and the fact that we're all going through it for the first time. I think in terms of our normal day-to-day operations at Chikululu, the biggest part of our work is a reinforcement of the beneficiary and the beneficiary being in the room, and the importance of that last mile of that whether you're in an urban or a rural setting, it should no circumstances, and the inequality in South Africa always presents these circumstances, but no circumstances should mean that someone else is in a worse off scenario than the next person. So in thinking about that and really talking to corporates and as well as talking to what we term in Chikululu as program partners, because we really believe in that element of partnerships who are civil society partners, it's been important that we follow on the themes that have been set internationally as well as locally. We know that on an international front, the Ford Foundation has led kind of a charge where there has been big organizations, big international organizations that have signed onto a pledge, that have committed to saying that, you know, in this difficult time, all of us being here and doing this for the first time, what do we do and how do we react in such a time? So we saw that the Ford Foundation had about 40 signatories already, where people or foundations, donors have actually said that in this time, we need to look at a different status quo. It's not business as usual. So on that, there's also been a local kind of push from IPASA, which is the body really that looks at philanthropy in South Africa. So the Independent Philanthropy Association in South Africa. So over there as well, there's been a charge, a call to donors, to foundations that are granting organizations to say we are in this situation and what can we do. So stemming from that, a lot of the discussions that have happened around the table really are around number one, and that's the most important part that before I did allude to as well, that assumption of positive intent. Sorry. Is there someone speaking?
No, please continue. There's somebody who hadn't unmuted themselves.
Okay, sorry. No, I think that a critical assumption of positive intent really does play itself out in terms of the organizations that are in the coal face in South Africa. A colleague of mine, Samira, actually, it's on our website right now, Chikululu website, wrote an article around the COVID response and the importance of welfare organizations in particular. So we are all operating in different sectors, whether it's youth development, education, health. We all obviously across sectors, but particularly looking at how we relate to each other between donors and foundations and people doing amazing work on the ground. So one of the things that's been really called for is flexibility. That's a big trend. Looking at flexibility from a point of view of how does it play itself out in terms of the agreed upon deliverables? How do we delay deliverables? How do we look at contractual obligations and say, this is what can be achieved and this is what can be achieved later? So much of that, what was spoken about in that first session around scenario planning and just having that flexibility be something that we are speaking about very confidently, because the COVID-19 national disaster is about each and every one of us taking some kind of responsibility, whether it's staying at home or making sure that essential services are there. If you are a development partner who's working with food security, for example, that's critical. That's an essential service, and so business has to carry on some level, but also taking into consideration all the rules around social distancing, around making sure that the staff, the workers are not burdened by this at this time. So these are kind of the intentions around the idea of chatting around flexibility in a very deliberate manner. Also, we're looking at like very practical things, like with a lockdown, no way you can actually have something like site visits. If site visits were a condition to a grant being released, or a condition around what would happen as a monitoring check. Having real discussions around the lockdown and saying, well, it's actually not practical and it's not doable to travel at this stage, but how can we do that in a way that doesn't harm the beneficiaries of that program, and the beneficiaries of the program, just not just the direct beneficiaries, but the community as a whole. And I think there's also a willingness right now to look at innovation, to look at agility, to look at conversations around what can be achieved now. So rather than sacrificing the whole thing, so not letting perfection stand in the way of good, that's going to be important right now, because obviously looking at the plans that we all have and what we had all planned for the year, there are some adjustments that can be made, but we can actually look realistically at what we can achieve and what we can't. And so I think another role that's been very important for the donor fraternity, as well as foundations, is to really look at the health and nutritional outcomes of the country and the important role that organizations in the development sector can play. So whether it's a youth development program or it's an early childhood development center, there's an important role to play in looking at the wider community and not just the immediate beneficiaries. So that's been a big trend in terms of having real discussions about health and nutritional outcomes. There's also just the communication aspect that I can never emphasize enough. And that requires a lot of listening on both sides. So it does require a lot of listening from donors. It also requires a lot of listening from implementers. So that listening allows us to have a conversation. Some donors have been proactive in letting the implementers know what is their stance. Some have treated on a very a sector-based basis. So in terms of looking at schools, if you have a schools-based program or an after-school program, there's no way you can go into the schools. So looking at that and looking at what that then means, especially for the program goals and what that is. So those conversations become a very, very critical part of the relationship between the donors as well as the implementers. So I can never stress enough the importance of an open dialogue, an open conversation, and just being able to trust each other and work together. So on the last thing I'm going to do is just answer some of the questions that have come in. The first being around getting donors to continue the support of your organization being difficult, and how you keep the loyalty. Again, it's what I just spoke about now, really around transparency and those conversations being the most important part of us working together, regardless of which sector you're in. Okay, the next question was around the best way going about fundraising at this time, as well as the balance of communication and engagement. I always say you can't over communicate enough when it comes to, especially because you are working together, but there is a financial exchange that takes place, and I think that requires a lot of trust. So you can't over communicate enough is always my personal motto, because an email communication won't take away someone's time. It won't demand for them to pay attention to it now. So it will give you the opportunity to then look at what are the best ways to be sharing information so that everybody's kind of on the same page. The last one on fundraising, I won't even, and I think for me, there's a lot of experts in the room on fundraising, and especially fundraising during this time. So I would hand over that question to someone like a Rufaro, and other amazing people that I've seen on this line that would be able to answer the question best. But like I said, in terms of establishing a status quo of communication with donors, with foundations, I think the best thing to do is have those transparent and honest conversations where both parties are listening to each other. Thank you, Rufaro.
Next speaker is going to be Homotso, who is an attorney and academic at the University of Johannesburg. She's a lecturer and she's a specialist in labor relations. A lot of the questions that we had around labor relations is really this balance between we're all stretched financially, and a lot of our activities are, and how we pay people is related to project activities taking place. So now that we've gone through kind of what strategically we need to think about, what financially we need to think about, what are those resources, now it's how do we work with and support our people well. So Homotso, without further ado, I'm going to hand this over directly to you for your presentation. I'm just going to quickly just make sure that you are checking the time. Please may you end at 11:20. Thank you.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me. So I'm going to even try and be faster than that. I don't see myself taking a full 15 minutes, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to start with really talking about something that I was asked in the crowdsourcing of questions about the Essential Services portal. It's not really my area, but just a quick search online, I discovered that to register as an essential service provider, you need to go through SIPC's Biz Portal website. It's bizportal.gov.za. So that is where you would go to apply to be considered an essential services for an essential service for the purpose of lockdown. But now moving over to really the labor perspective, I think what's really important, and it's sort of a question that I was asked in relation to what are the sort of important regulations that people need to know right now about how they interact with their staff, and what is government saying in relation to support. So there's two key initiatives by government in relation to staff or really supporting of businesses regarding staff salaries or avoidance of retrenchment and things of that nature. The first is the Temporary Employee or Employer Relief Fund, okay, or TERS. So in essence, you can apply for this through TCMA, and it is to try and provide relief for businesses that might find themselves in the position where they need to retrench over the next, it is really over a period of time following the lockdown. So it relates much more to following the lockdown, the period following the lockdown, as opposed to right now in this 21 days. So a business or an organization that foresees, look, it's likely based on what has happened in this 21 days, or even just before the lockdown, it is likely that we might find ourselves needing to retrench staff. So we need relief to avoid retrenching staff, okay? So that's really what that is about. And then there is also the National Disaster Benefit, for which you can apply through the UIF website, the Unemployment Insurance Fund. I think they said yesterday that about 3 billion rand has already been made immediately available for that. So employers or employees can apply to UIF, and that is really salary support, okay? An important thing about both of these is that it really applies to assisting employees. So if on your staff you have people who are independent contractors who are not employees, these initiatives do not apply to them. And now I don't mean fixed term employees, somebody who you brought on for 5 months or 6 months to run a particular project. That could be a fixed term employee. I'm talking about a consultant, some sort of an independent contractor. Those initiatives will not help them. So that is quite problematic if you ask me. It's something that I've been looking into. And I really think from an organizational perspective, organizations should consider ways in which they can support such people who might be losing income as a result of this time period. But that is, of course, a private initiative. I know one organization, a private sector business that is raising money. They are looking at raising funds to support independent contractors that they work with. So that is something you might want to consider. Of course, based on what the conversations have been so far, donor funding for ordinary operations of nonprofits and NGOs is also problematic, but that is something each organization will consider as they go along. Another important issue that's come up a lot in relation to labor relations is the question of leave. So government has been quite non-prescriptive about how one is supposed to be dealing with leave issues. Some companies are insisting that staff take unpaid leave. Some companies are insisting that staff take ordinary leave or take their ordinary leave. Now, I think my big challenge with this is leave is a very private entitlement. So I wonder if it's going to be something that is challenged after the fact, that people have been sort of forced to take leave during this time. So it's an entitlement that you have in law for your own private use. So I'm wondering about the legalities of whether or not it will be fair for companies to insist that their staff take leave at this time. Of course, many people are. Now, the other issue is, and this sort of feeds into sort of what I want to talk about after, but the other issue for me is I don't think it's justifiable to ask staff to take leave and work from home, which I've realized that quite a number of companies are doing. They will say, okay, it appears as though you've got 10 days leave, take the leave, but work from home. We're still going to send you emails. We're still going to ask you to write reports. We're still going to ask you to be productive, despite the fact that you are on leave. So you've now taken your leave. You won't have access to that leave, you know, come December when you would like to spend time with your family or travel or whatever the case may be. You won't have access to it, but you've been told you still need to work during this time. So I think from a sector perspective, we should be really leading in terms of the type of interaction we have with our staff. Are we caring organizations? Do we care about the needs of our staff? Do we care about what is fair and just, as opposed to only doing things because of the law allows us to do 1, 2, 3? So I think the difficulty with that is one really needs to consider whether or not we want to do this kind of thing, whether or not we want to insist that staff take leave, if we also insist that they're going to be working from home. If people are working from home, I don't see any basis for insisting that they take leave. But broadly, and sort of to that point, I think what organizations need to be considering is the fact that, of course, over the next 6 months to 2 or 3 years, you're likely going to see a lot of retrenchments. You're likely going to see a lot of cutbacks in donor funding. So we need to really pay attention to how we utilize our staff, what is best for staff, in light of the reality that there are likely to be retrenchments in the foreseeable future. So around things like upskilling, encouraging staff to upskill themselves, encouraging training, all of those sorts of things where you are really encouraging your staff to grow and diversify their skill set. I think that'll be very useful from a sector perspective. I would also encourage organizations to consider, who has what skills, who needs what skills, what value do these skills add to the organization, what skills are we missing? So really, it's a personal and organizational skills audit that I would encourage organizations to consider, because the reality is the skills that we needed 2 years ago. I mean, my colleague earlier on spoke about strategy and about how the world is changing so rapidly. What we needed 2 to 3 years ago, we're not going to need literally in the next 6 months to a year. This 21-day lockdown has also drastically changed the way in which organizations work and function. It's made organizations consider new ways of functioning that they might carry on into the future. So it's really about considering what are smarter ways of working, how can we adjust to that, and how do we still see staff fitting into that space? How can we still support staff to engage in that space and still be useful to the organization? And how do we also in that add value to our staff? So I think really I would encourage organizations to be smart and strategic about how they look at ways in which to utilize staff. And lastly, I would say that it's very important. My colleague will touch on issues of wellness, so I won't go too far. But one of the things that I've realized with staff in times of crisis is that strong leadership, organized leadership, and communicative leadership are critical in times like this. Staff having direction, feeling like there is direction, feeling like their leaders are providing direction and communicating that direction effectively is so important for staff well-being, for everyone's level of anxiety, for everyone to understand where and how they are moving inside of this crisis and after this crisis. I wouldn't advocate for constant communication, but considerable communication, so staff can understand where they fit in, what direction the organization is taking, what are the things they need to do every day, what are the things that the organization expects of them. The organization also encouraging them to take pauses and breaks. Those things are very, very important. Strong communicative leadership is going to be critical in this time to help your staff settle in and adjust to a difficult time like a lockdown and the time that follows the lockdown. That's all from me, and I'll await some questions.
Thank you, Komotso. I'm going to be going straight into Andy's presentation. So please do keep posting your questions. We are going to open up, so we're going to make sure that we have time to address the questions in after 11:30 is where we are aiming for. So our next presenter is Andy Hatfield, who is the CEO of For Good. He's been posting throughout some brilliant links that For Good, which is a social impact startup that connects people and organizations and companies to causes and such as the work that nonprofits do. So Andy, I'm going to hand over to you to really go through some of the ways that we can structure our operations and remain productive, but also as from the perspective of managers and leaders of organizations, how do we move into a new way of working, managing other people to be productive, and then also manage ourselves within kind of navigating that new way of doing and being. So Andy, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. It's really been fascinating. Okay, let me handle a quick question because I saw it came up. The Solidarity Fund. As far as I understand, the Solidarity Fund, Jill, you mentioned this, is actually not supporting SMEs. There's plenty of them out there that are supporting SMEs. The Solidarity Fund is there to prevent, detect, care, and support. So it's much more of a social cultural movement. That I stand corrected, I don't speak on behalf of them. I think they're sitting on 2.5 billion or more. They're not distributing yet, but they should start soon. So I would keep an eye on that website is probably the best way to stay in touch with them. Okay, so thanks. You gave a quick intro to For Good and what we do. I mean, very, very quickly, we're a marketplace that allows NPOs from across South Africa to capture exactly what they need, and then we expose those needs to an audience of public volunteers and corporate employee volunteering programs. So we represent 15 multinational or listed corporates in South Africa, 30,000 corporate employees, probably 50,000 public volunteers. So it's a fairly substantial and significant site in terms of pointing people at social problems. It's been fascinating to watch as just part of the quick intro. Usually on For Good, when there's any kind of social or cultural upheaval, traffic dies. So during Nene Gate and Fees Must Fall and Pravin Gate and all our gates, traffic just disappears. People just, charity starts at home and they don't volunteer. This has been completely opposite. Site traffic has tripled over the last kind of three to 5 weeks. And there's been a flood of incredibly highly skilled people that are reaching out to our 400 plus NPOs, primarily with the aim of skills-based volunteering. So that's us. I think that was a very eloquent kind of description of the problem. I think the best thing I could do, aside from take a bunch of questions, is just to tell you how we at For Good thought through this. So we're a small organization, 7-8 staff, which I think is probably very similar to many SMEs in South Africa. And I thought I'd start off, my friend in HR was also very interesting around this, but to kind of think through the brutal truths of your team and your employees, and what you're going to do with them. And this might have been a little more relevant a week or two ago, but I think people are just starting to settle down and realize how long this might be around for. So the way we put it in terms of what you can do, and I definitely do wonder if a lot of these will be challenged, but what you can do with employees very brutally is you can pay them and get them to work remote. That's what we've done, and I'll chat a bit more about that. You can pay them and you can pause their work for the duration of the lockdown if remote work is not possible. I'm hoping a lot of South Africans that are in the privileged position of having domestic helpers or gardeners will continue to pay them, despite them potentially not being able to work. You can put them on annual paid leave. As far as I understand, I'm not an HR expert, but as far as I understand, you can, the annual leave is at the discretion of the employer. So as a company closes for leave in December, for instance, where you force employees to take a certain amount of leave, you could probably do that. At least your employees get paid. You can have your executive team, your senior managers take salary reductions. We've seen that happen quite a lot. There's a bunch of companies, EOH, Woolworths, etc., who are taking significant executive or management pay cuts. There is probably an unpaid leave option. I would consult an HR professional if possible, where your employee can claim from UIF. But I saw one of these questions on the chat. UIF is geared towards lower income employees. So if you have higher income employees that are critical to your organization, as the person on the chat was saying, UIF is not going to cover a significant amount of their existing salary. Employee salary reductions, we're seeing that quite a lot as well. Then you can appeal to various government or private sector relief funds. There's a ton of them popping up. And that link I shared about the comprehensive collection of resources, that is an incredible treasure trove of information, really nicely sorted out into categories. And you'll find an enormous amount of stuff there. That is kind of the one link that I think can help guide any organization through, from an operational perspective, through this crisis. And then, of course, retrenchments and all those other negative things as a last resort. So that's kind of the brutal truth. That's how we thought about it right at the beginning. But the reality is often more nuanced because we are dealing with people, after all. We're all citizens of the planet that is going through this. So at For Good, we kind of thought through it in two ways. We put together a philosophy, and it's a philosophy we then kind of repeated at all our team meetings for the first couple of weeks, just to make sure that we got it. So the first one is, and I put a link to this in the chat as well, don't panic. and get a flu shot if you can, if they're stuck. A lot of the chaos that's being caused is being caused by people that are panicking. It's absolutely fascinating to see that everyone is suddenly a healthcare professional and have their own very, very, weighty opinions on the corona pandemic and what to do. Our second philosophy was we're a small team, and even if we weren't, if someone gets sick, we've got your back. I think it's so important to remember operationally that we're dealing with people, and people need to be reassured first and foremost. And so reassuring them that if something happens, that you have their back, I think is really, really important. We're in a really privileged position of actually having just raised venture capital. And so our third piece of philosophy was, given that privileged position we're in as a company, we need to be able to help our ecosystem wherever we can. And I think, there probably are quite a few companies who have enough runway, talking 3 to 6 months, to kind of get through this. And if you are in that position, it really is your duty and obligation to help out as much as possible. We're doing an enormous amount of promotion and PR and marketing and advertising around driving skills-based volunteers to nonprofits to help get over this bump. Number 4 is to keep moving forward. I think organizational staleness or entropy can set in really, really quickly. So your KPIs, your goals, your OKRs, your performance management frameworks, those kind of things, those have to stay in place. You have to keep striving to move forward as an organization, or you're going to stay still, and worst case, you're probably going to move backwards. It's just about finding different ways to get to those goals. And I'm sure you can shove 1,000 examples at me that say, oh, well, now it's impossible. But you've really got to think cleverly to keep your organization moving forward. If you're wondering about how to stick out when you are applying for funding from various sources, including that really cool fund that CAFSA has set up, one of the ways you stick out is by showing what you're doing. And showing that you are moving forward as an organization. And you have to be quite dynamic and quite brutal about that. Timescale. We plan in 2 to 4 week bursts. That's probably more like 1 week bursts at the moment. Time does seem to crawl when you're at home. So we plan in 1 week bursts, but we understand that this could last for the rest of the year or beyond. The sooner you kind of get that into your head that this is not a short-term thing. Whether we get on top of the healthcare side of it, we're going to be suffering the economic consequences of this for a while to come. On any outbound communication, number 6 in our philosophy, be it public or private, whether you're talking with your team or talking externally to donors, beneficiaries, communities, audiences, if it feels icky, don't do it. Think before you tweet, think before you post, think before you share. You have to be really, really careful about what you stand for and what you're communicating out there. There's a lot of rubbish. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of anxiety. Don't contribute to it. Number 7, don't lose touch with each other. One of the cool things we do from that perspective is every Friday we have a Google Hangouts, a pub hangout. So the whole team hops on, everyone grabs a drink, alcoholic, non-alcoholic, you choose your poison. And we try not to talk about work. We just hang out for 30 to 60 minutes and just kind of catch up on how the lockdown is, how working remotely is, and just hang out so that you don't lose touch with the humanity of what makes a team a team. Number 8, if you're bored, learn. We've been running at full tilt. It's been amazing. I feel like I've worked harder during the lockdown than I ever have before. But at some stage, there are going to be elements of your business that slow down. And if you're bored, it is a wonderful opportunity to learn. And number 9 is that we completely and utterly understand that kids will invade video calls from time to time. So don't shout at them. And always remember that the video camera is on. There are some very interesting things that happen when people forget that it isn't. So that's kind of our philosophy. And this all bleeds into operations because, of course, operations is about people. And then I'll take you very quickly through, I suppose, our first set of quick decisions that we made as a team and how we approached this. We've actually been virtual since the 17th of March, so we're a little ahead of the game, which means, scarily enough, we're approaching a month virtual, which is frightening, but we're starting to get used to it. You need to choose a technology stack early on, and if you haven't done it, make a choice and stick with it. So Google Hangouts and Slack are our platforms of choice. Both are free. We happen to pay for the premium versions of both because we find value in it. One of the big things I think NPOs are missing out on is G Suite or Google for Nonprofits, which is a way to get all of Google's tools, including Hangouts, email, calendar, the works, and I stand corrected, but I think it's like $5,000 of free advertising a month. It's an insane amount. And you can get it for free as a nonprofit. So just go and Google for nonprofits. But choose a tech stack, choose a set of tools, and then stick to them. Consistency is a really important part of being operationally ready and operationally transparent during this time. We paused all hiring during the lockdown. I was pretty sad about that. We were about to create 3 jobs. But on one side, I just think it's a little unfair to bring someone completely new into a team when you are all remote. It is possible. There are plenty of companies around the world that do it. But we felt that it was just too disruptive. Plus, by pausing hiring, we increased runway, increased cash flow, etc. We agreed to do daily stand-ups in team. So our company split into 3 divisions, and those divisions have daily video stand-ups at a set time every day. That's also quite important. There's a lot of advice floating around about remote work, and I'll point you to a great starter kit that you can use. One of the ones that resonated with me was getting people to arrive at work, even if it's virtually, at the same time every day, and then check in like you would when you walk into the office. Like, hi, I'm here, how's everyone doing? And to set that kind of routine is really important, because then you remember that it is work. So our sub-segment teams, they have daily stand-ups, and then we have a team stand-up every week. So for 1 hour every single week, the whole team is present, and then we run through, as we did when we were all at the office, we run through operations, we run through performance metrics, we run through challenges. We split those into kind of burning towers, so things that are, things that need immediate attention. Wins, important to keep celebrating the wins in the team, and then major things in progress that everyone needs to be aware of. Any visual stuff that you had? So if you're any way related to technology, or you're just a fan of Japanese project management, many teams might use Kanban boards. It's those things where you have columns, and then you move sticky notes from column to column as you do work, especially prevalent in development and agile culture. All those visual boards we've moved onto Google Sheets, which is basically PowerPoint online that everyone can edit at the same time. So we try to keep as much visual feedback of what's going on as possible. And social media, so for a while we've been actually sharing social media between the team, so it allows everyone to kind of have a turn with the brand voice. But I think the important thing about social media was a decision we made to amplify what's good that's out there, but be very, very careful not to become a voice around official information. Official information needs to come from the government, not from us. And so we're very, very careful with retweeting anything to do with healthcare or any opinions to do with healthcare. That is not our brand positioning. And that is kind of one of these operational imperatives that we set early on. So those are kind of like 2 quick overviews, brutal truths about your team and what you can do with them, how we handled it for good. One major thing I want to point you towards is that collection of resources. I'll paste the link when I mute myself again. But it is an astonishing collection of absolutely everything you need to know, from how to find the relief funds. There was my HR friend was talking about essential services and the certificates that you need to give staff. And there are templates for that, for instance. And there's an enormous amount of strategic articles. There's a whole bunch of reports that have been released by all the consulting firms looking at the impact of Corona on the economy and the impact on work and all of those sorts of things. In there, if you click through to that resource, search for Remote Work Starter Kit, and you will find a really fascinating Google presentation, which you can download as a PDF, that gives you kind of the easy 1, 2, 3 guide to how to manage operations remotely in an organization of any size. It really is comprehensive. It includes a really nice remote work health check, which we've actually run once at For Good and plan to run again. It's 8 very simple questions where you can gauge the temperature of your organization and how things are holding up from a people and an operational point of view. So that really is your guide to running an organization during Corona. And I think that's about it. I would love, instead of me just prattling on, I would really love to take some questions and answer specific things about what's going on and remote work technology, how For Good can help you, etc., etc. So I will mute for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andy. We aren't doing great on time, but I'm hoping that the insights that are being shared are helpful and we'll be able to continue kind of interacting together. So for the next 20 minutes, we're going to be having an interactive discussion. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to try to have an exchange and some interaction. I'm going to ask these specific questions that have been posed for the panelists in the chats, which I'm going to quickly ask now, and I'll ask the panelists to just quickly unmute themselves so that they could answer those questions. How this will work is that please, in the chat, please put your name and that you want to speak. So we're going to basically go through a first come, first serve. So first is going to be the questions that have been posed to the panelists, and then the next one is going to be as the chat goes through, and we'll go until 12 o'clock. Just make sure that you're using the chat, and then I will call on you to say, here you are, you're now, to call on you based on what I'm seeing here. So I hope that makes sense, and we're gonna continue with this learning curve. Thanks everyone, this is going great. So our first question, so I'm going to go to the top of some of the questions that we had. So Jill has put the questions around how to connect with how to register with CAF Southern Africa in the meantime. But there's one question here which I'm hoping that you'll be able to help. So so Jill, is it worthwhile for South African NPOs to seek fundraising at this time?
Okay, all right. Colleagues, it's a very interesting question. In terms of our work at CAF Southern Africa, and in terms of our research around African philanthropy, etc., our ideological leaning has been towards really fostering and growing African philanthropy on our continent. In other words, seeking funding from within to solve our own problems on the continent, and focusing less on depending on international donors. We just released the World Giving Index report last year. It was a 10-year consolidation of findings, which is showing that Africa is fundamentally a continent, a generous continent. The research measured generosity behaviors, and Africa has been closing the gap with the global north in terms of generosity behaviors like giving cash, donating time, giving goods, etc. So ideologically, up until this point, we've really been focused on building our own African philanthropy. Having said that, obviously, the current crisis presents a whole different set of circumstances. And so, obviously it's dependent on the capacity of each of the organizations. I suppose I would counsel a slight bit of caution in that I think that's all well and good to apply to international donors. I think that just to be mindful that for many of these donors, particularly based in the US, the application criteria is really taxing, really labor intensive. The requirements are pedantic. So I think the question is to balance whether, you would have the time and the resources to complete those very, very complicated funding applications. But again, I'd say it's an individual choice, and I guess one should really just research very closely who you are wanting to target and make sure that you meet the application criteria of that particular international donor, just to save you time and effort. That would be my advice.
Okay. Thank you, Jill, and thank you for posting all of the resources and who to contact from CAPSA. I'm going to move to the next question, but I'm just going to add to what Jill has been saying, is that one of the first steps, I think, even in her presentation is, and also in Kholile's presentation, was shore up the resources that you have. So make sure before you're looking for new funding, take time to kind of shore up the resources and current funders that you have and communicate with them while you are scoping and researching for new funding. There is a lot out there, but it is quite complex. And we have very limited resources and time and capacity, and we need to be aware of that as nonprofits and social enterprises. So make sure that you kind of do a due diligence to make sure that you're not just running after every fund that's available, but that it is aligned to your strategy. Is not something that you're going to be creating from scratch as new just so that you can get the money. And also making sure that you are communicating with the funders that you currently have, and perhaps even just talking to them. I know with a board that I sit on, just by sharing the new things and the ways that the organization was kind of responding to COVID-19 and some of the challenges in the education sector, the funder kind of came on board and said, tell us more, and perhaps they could repurpose or actually add more funding. So communicating with your current resources is really important on that front. So I'm going to go to the next question, and that one was to Khomotso, and this is a really important one from an HR and labor perspective. So it was asked by Nsimbini, which is in situations where an employee is forced to take leave and she refuses and is threatened if they don't take leave, they'll be fired. And so eventually takes leave under duress. What is the recourse for such an employee, especially considering that regular avenues such as CCMA are currently closed? And I know it's a very personal thing and it's a very direct matter, but maybe you could contextualize it in a larger framework, because for some organizations, we are going to have to make tough decisions that people might not agree with and feel that they've been forced to take. So it's just this balance of ethics, law, and liquidity again. Khomotso?
So yeah, so I saw that question, and so I'm weary of making a legal statement. This is going to be deemed to be fair. This is going to be deemed to be unfair. So I won't do that. And even my speculation in relation to how leave will work, it's important for me to qualify by saying we have not seen this. So this situation is very unprecedented, which means there's no legal precedent, which means even the CCMA will be dealing with these types of matters afresh. And considering what will be deemed to be an unfair labor practice and not. So I think what's really, really important, and in relation to most HR issues, even with regards to salaries, it should be a very collaborative discussion as to what is best for the business, what is best for staff, what can staff handle, what kind of pay cut are senior managers willing to take, what sort of things can everybody do to accommodate the difficulty of the situations. So on the face of it, it does not appear correct to me that somebody should be forced to take leave. However, in the end, leave is an issue of employer discretion. So what I will say, and I know that my answer is quite open-ended, is that I definitely believe that employees are going to be able to go to the CCMA once the CCMA is open again, which will be right after the lockdown lifts. The referrals to the CCMA will not be deemed late. So remember, if you've got an issue, which we call an unfair labor practice, if you've got like a leave dispute, it's called an unfair labor practice dispute, and you've got 90 days from becoming aware of the unfair labor practice to lodge a claim with the CCMA. And I do anticipate that you will still have plenty of time an employee will still have plenty of time to lodge the dispute after lockdown is lifted, even if it's extended. The CCMA will take into consideration the fact that it was closed during a lockdown. So it's not that people will be late. Of course, unfortunately, there's nothing that can be done in this moment. You would have to wait to lodge a dispute at the CCMA once it's open again. So that is something employees will have to wait for. But I would urge leadership of NGOs to make decisions in a collaborative way. I would urge leadership of NGOs to not be draconian in the way they apply legal principles and staff policies. This is an unprecedented times that we're in. So the more pressure, the more type of almost violent pressure you put on your staff in that way, the more there's going to be pushback in relation to the way they try and assist the company to recover from this process. So some of these things are not questions of law. They are not even questions of your existing policy. Some of these things are about how do you interact with your staff? How do you interact with your staff going forward? What kind of decisions are you making now, and how will that impact how you interact with your staff going forward? So I would encourage management and leadership of organizations and businesses to think of it in that way.
Great.
I hope I answered.
Yes, you did. Thank you. I'm just checking to see if there's any other unanswered questions. There's a big question around kind of registration. I'm not sure if there's anyone kind of in the room or online who is able to answer this question about kind of balancing, if you're registered as an NPO, there isn't that option to like on the TERS registration, on Solidarity Fund registration, etc. It's a little bit different for us because as NK, we are registered as a nonprofit company as well as a PBO. But for others, it might be a little bit more of a challenge. So I'm actually going to put it out there as probably something that we need to look more into, is to how to connect NPOs with some of the existing resources, and or ask government how we can be included in that registration. I do think that we could probably just reach out and say, hey, we are also organizations that employ people. So yes. So now I'm opening up if there's anyone who would like to ask any questions. Please indicate in the chat and or best practice of what you have experienced and what you are doing in your organizations. I'll wait to see in the chat. This is your chance, as Andy has rightfully said. So while we're waiting for people to respond, one of the things, and to kind of put up their hands to share some of their best practices, one of the questions that we had is, how do you make environmental education and wildlife care a priority in terms of funding, especially when, it could appear not to be a priority when it comes to COVID-19? Michelle, I think that is a great question. And in general, relatively to say, how do you make the work that you do and the funding that you and the work that you do when it's not related specifically to kind of health and education and all these other concerns, how do you make sure that it still stays relevant and in the eyes of a funder? So hopefully somebody would be able to kind of put their hands up and answer that and what their thoughts are. Just unmute yourself and speak.
Hi, Rufaro.
Hi, go ahead, Charmaine.
I think one of the things that's been declared by government is that this is an essential service around conservation and protection of ecosystems as well as species. So I think in terms of the foundations and the donors that are already on hand, I think, again, communicating the needs around that essential services and also implications, right, around which donor priorities may have changed or may be influenced by that. But understanding that on a national level, this is an essential service as your point of start or your foundation. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. I hope that helps, Michelle. Yeah.
Rufaro, if I may just jump in.
Sure.
I think that from a broader perspective, I think to me it's also important to also maintain some perspective, which says that what we're experiencing, yes, is unique. I mean, when a government orders millions of people to sit in their houses and not come out, it's quite unique, right? But at the same time, I think there are aspects of this that as a global community we've experienced before, and these things are cyclical, right? Something becomes quickly comes to the forefront of everybody's mind. Donors, everybody literally lines up every resource to that, all right? And sooner or later, everybody realizes that they're ignoring certain aspects of the global community, and that's creating downstream impact. And you almost have a reversal of trends, and people come back to focus on those things. So I think it's important to maintain perspective and say that with all hope, with all the efforts that are being done, at some point the pandemic will pass. We're going to have a bit of a post-pandemic period. I think a lot of the resources will still be directed towards mitigating sort of the post-COVID impact. And then I think what's going to happen is we're going to start recognizing that we've neglected certain things and they're now coming back to the forefront, right? So I think there's a perspective which says here, let's also remember that this is a particular period that is going to reorganize the world to some extent. But if we look broadly at how the world operates, things tend to circle back a little bit and realign. And so I think that's somehow also that's an important perspective to maintain as we go through this period. The second thing I wanted to also just point out is I think we also have to be realistic with our goals, right? If I am an organization that was already struggling to fundraise within a particular community, COVID is perhaps not going to change that very much, and in all likelihood, I'm still going to struggle post-COVID, right? And so when we revise our goals, let's also be realistic. There's not going to be much of a magic wand, and what you were probably struggling with in terms of attracting attention in certain corners will still, in all likelihood, continue after that. And you must still be thinking about how you can expand your captive audience, whether it is in terms of human resources or financial resources or anything else. So I think I just wanted to put that there, and just maybe in these times of panic and anxiety, maintain a bit of perspective. Things are cyclical, and we will at some point sort of circle back to some sort of new reality, but certain things will also remain a little bit the same, and we can still take advantage of those things.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those two answers. We have a few questions here. So Marina asks, what is the best way to deal with funders wanting to redirect funding from your NPO to the COVID crisis? I'm not sure if there's anyone who has dealt with it. I have my own opinions on it, but we'll give it to the floor if anyone wants to put their 2 cents in.
I mean, just quickly, so very bittersweetly, there was a bunch of money that corporates were going to spend on our events and activation services, and that magically turned into donations to NPOs. So we lost the money, but some very worthy NPOs got it. So I totally understand the situation that they're in. And as I said in the chat, from my perspective, there's not a lot you can do. You just check your contracts. check what your exit clauses are and see whether they are entitled to move funding away from you to other COVID-related stuff. And if they are, well, that's the reality. It's like capitalist commercial businesses will move spend away from non-essential services during this time.
Anyone else?
I think this is also a personal experience. We had a bit of that. And what we then did is have a conversation to understand what aspects of what the funder, in this case wasn't a donor, it was actually a funder, was looking to engage in, we could respond to. Now, back to Rufaro's point earlier, you do not want to be building from scratch. This has to be capabilities that you can very quickly deploy, right? So maybe there's a solution that we're working on, a particular digital solution, and we actually discussed internally and realized that with just a few tweaks, we could actually respond to what the funder was looking to fund. And so while we lost some of the money because we couldn't respond to everything, we were able to retain some of that funding because we were able to tweak some aspects of our digital solution. So again, it goes back to that adaptability, agility, but don't try and reinvent the wheel. Don't start from scratch because it's going to take you too much time. You're going to divert your attention from other things that you could be doing. And in the end, you might not be able to secure the funding.
Thank you, Robbie. So then there's another big question here, which is, as we're all moving to remote work, this one is from Merhead, which I think is really, really helpful. And I think pertinent to all of us as we change how we operate, is not all of our staff have access to computers, and we also have quite a lot of ground staff. So how do you balance on getting everyone on board using their cell phones and potentially giving them more money for data against kind of holding on to money to make sure that you have cash flow to pay the people? So I'd be interested to see if anyone has kind of an experience that they have and how they've dealt with that.
Yeah, very quickly, just assuming not everyone is reading the chat. There's two things. One is to have a discussion with your team about how money saved on transport could be used to top up data. But that also requires that you do something as a company. You lead first. And so shop around for data. There was an amazing rain special pre-lockdown. I don't know if it's still going, but they were distributing SIM cards with a bunch of data free for 7 days with Cosmo magazines. I think they also deliver SIM cards. You've got to check coverage and things like that. AfriHost has a lot of cheap data. And you might find that a couple of $100 per employee suddenly gets you connected. Sorry, I know someone else wants to answer, so I'll mute as well.
I was going to jump in. So I do think I agree with the point that's just been made, but I do think a lot of the issues around data, I mean, it is something that employers should really be focusing on trying to provide, because I mean, at the end of the day, the way people operate has changed, and they cannot necessarily be asked to fund the operations of the business as staff. I think that it is, yeah, I mean, look, all of this, and one of the questions that I can sort of answer in the same breath, one of the questions was around salaries and top up of salaries versus the 17,000 Rand that's provided by UIF, or the cap of 17,000 Rands. All of these issues around money, it goes back to my point about collaborating on solutions and thinking about how we can all sort of come to the party. Everybody's going to lose something. So one of the things that I often say to people in the legal context is that when you're negotiating these sorts of issues, everybody must be prepared to lose something for the ship to stay afloat. So I think that is really the conversation to be having with staff in relation to things like data costs. I know that from a university perspective, the university has actually engaged us to say, do you need data? Do you have a Wi-Fi router? Are you able to give lectures online? That's something that they've actually reached out to us and said, do you have this capability as staff? And on over and above that, we've had to make sure that students have that capability. So it's very much a collaborative effort. And again, I urge leaders to make decisions collaboratively with staff, taking into consideration their socioeconomic needs.
Thank
If
you.
I could just come in here.
Sure, go ahead, Jill.
Yeah, Gamotso. probably the bulk of our team at CAFSA were not set up to work from home and struggled with capability and capacity. So we had to redirect some funds just to make sure that each and every one of our team was accessible. Of course, it was the emotional shift that people needed to make, but also obviously the technical capabilities. And as Andy said, we've shopped around, we've got some good deals, and yeah, our very small team now is connected 24/7. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not, but there it is.
Thank you for that. I'm also going to now wrap up because we've just hit the 12 o'clock mark, and I want to make sure that we are honoring everyone's time. We've posted in the chat, there's quite a few resources and links that people have shared and ideas that people have shared. We are going to be kind of compiling those together and making sure that those go out with the link to the recorded webinar. I'm going to reach out to the panelists to find out their comfort levels in terms of people individually contacting them and or resources or links that people can contact your organizations to get more insights. From a communications perspective and with your team, I really highly recommend just asking your team what do they need and for them to be as honest as possible. And also really that approach of saying what are our principles and sharing those with the team, because that helps to make sure that you're kind of being kept on track and keeping accountable. As nonprofit managers and leaders, I really think that we do need to ask for help. So reach out. This event came out from reaching out to others and saying, look, I need help. I'm not sure what to do. And so please don't be afraid to reach out to yourself and to your team and actually say for some things, I don't know, I'm going to have to go and look for the answer to that. And hopefully we can start having these conversations more often. We are looking at making this a series, but if this is the last and the first and the last one, I'm just going to say thank you so much for participating, for your engagement, and I hope that you found this as useful as I have personally, and I hope that we are able to continue to connect and share and collaborate as we work through this very, very weird and unprecedented time, but also exciting for the number of opportunities. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful long weekend. Please do take the public holidays off, and we wish you peace of mind, health, and safety to all. If you're still online and you want to just quickly unmute yourself and say thank you and hello to everyone, please feel free to do that, and that'll be the end of our call.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.